Hi, everyone. Welcome to another collaborative episode, this time between Return to Bandung, hosted by Pranay Somayajula, and my podcast, the International Solidarity Pod. This episode served to mark the 1 year anniversary of the beginning of the Return to Bandung podcast. And Pranay was gracious enough to have me on for this episode to discuss anti-imperialist political education. This will likely be, the first of several upcoming collaborations between our podcasts, so stay tuned for that. In this episode, Pranay and I approach the question of anti-imperialist political education from the point of view of both of us having started our respective projects as political education projects of one form or another, but also as new academics, since both of us have recently started our PhDs. So, in the episode, we discuss navigating Western academia as Third World Marxists. We try to work through what the aims of our two respective podcasts are, what political education really means, who our respective audiences are, what our methods are, and more. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and like this video. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review to get this podcast to new audiences. Also, please share this podcast with others in your life. Word of mouth makes a huge difference. Lastly, and importantly, if you're able to contribute small amounts of money or would like to be a monthly donor, you can do that on Patreon. I've left that linked in the description below, in addition to where you can find our Instagram and Substack. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Pranay on anti-imperialist political education.
Ashwin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to, be here to do this collaborative episode. Looking forward to the conversation we have ahead of us.
Absolutely. I mean, the pleasure is all mine. I have been really, really looking forward to this. I can't believe that it's already been a year since I started Return to Bandung. I mean, it feels like it was just yesterday, and I've had the opportunity in that time to, interview so many incredible people whose work I've looked up to for a really long time, and also get connected to new people who I didn't know before, but who I've really loved getting to know and getting to know their work. And you are definitely one of those people. I think if I recall correctly, I think the way we were first connected was you'd reached out to me over Instagram many, many months ago. And I'd never heard of Journal of International Solidarity before. But once you invited me to come onto your show to talk about Hindu nationalism, I believe it was, I kind of started doing a deep dive into your work, and found just so many overlaps in our interests, and our sort of academic and activist paths, which I know we'll talk about a little bit in this conversation. And so, as I was thinking about the fact that we are at 1 year of Return to Bandung, I wanted to do something kind of special for a 1 year anniversary episode. And I thought, what better way to do that than to do something we haven't done before, which is a collaborative episode with your really, really excellent podcast, Journal of International Solidarity. It's funny, I feel like there's been so much overlap in our guests. We often interview the same people, and I've often found that when I'm interviewing someone who has been on your show before, I really like listening to the interview you did with them. So it really helps shape my thinking in terms of like, what sort of questions do I want to ask this person? How do I want to approach the conversation? How can we sort of complement each other? And I think that's a really important part of building an ecosystem of radical independent left media, which I know we'll also talk about a bit today here as well. But yeah, this is, just for the listeners, this is, like I said, very different than other episodes we've done so far, which have been much more of a structured interview with the guest where I ask a set of pre-written questions. I was working with Ashwin before this to put together a general sort of outline, more of a roadmap, just to kind of structure the conversation a little bit. But this is really much more informal. It's meant to be much more conversational, and just sort of a wide-ranging discussion about our respective approach to anti-imperialist political education. And I'm hoping that, we'll go off on tangents and things will come up during the conversation. And so all of that is also to say, just the caveat that this is very much an experiment and we'll see how this goes. So it might be a little bit less polished than some of the other episodes that I've done before, but I hope that you, the lovely listeners, will bear with me on that. And definitely, this is not going to be the last time you'll be hearing from Ashwin. We're hoping to have this be the first of sort of a recurring series of Ashwin periodically coming on the show as a guest host to discuss various topics, do sort of deep dives into different texts, every now and again, just to sort of mix things up a bit. So it's not always just the same format of very, very strict interview style, because as wonderful as those are, they can also get a little bit old. And I figured after a year of doing just that, why not switch it up a bit? So with that, I want to just welcome you again, Ashwin. I'm so grateful to have you here, and I wonder if you could, before we start our conversation, if you could introduce yourself, your background, your work, share some of that for the listeners. And I'm also especially curious to hear a bit about your personal political journey and development. Obviously, I think we both come from a very similar political and ideological perspective of at least the way I think about it personally, and feel free to say if you conceive of your own politics differently as sort of being this sort of third world Marxism. I'm just curious sort of how you came to that. And of course, if I've mischaracterized your politics, please do, please do correct me. But yeah, we'd love to hear about how you came to that position, and maybe where you started and how you got to where you are. So with that, yeah, I'll toss it over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, and again, thanks for having me, Pranay. And this is a great opportunity to collaborate. Our projects are sort of got started at a similar time. In fact, I guess, going to start my first tangent here. I should say that my my project started out as like a written format, the Journal of International Solidarity. I was writing articles. I started out, first with an article on, it was titled "Why Indians Must See Themselves in Palestine," and I was, starting to try to address it toward people in my community, people around me, South Asians, Indians in particular. I think, I have obviously other South Asian folks in my community, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, but there is a history of solidarity among those communities. There's the Islam being a common unifier kind of thing. This is much less the case, especially recently, so amongst Indians. So that I started with that. Your podcast for sure at some point contributed and played a role in I guess, having me shift from a written format to a podcast format. And again, we're talking about anti-imperialist political education, so we can talk about the reasons why. I thought maybe I could reach more people. Reading, it's harder for me myself to read several pieces consecutively as opposed to listening to audio that I can do in transit or while doing tasks, that kind of thing. So yeah, no, all this to say, I'm glad to be collaborating with you and to have this, I guess, collaboration series move ahead. Um, as per me and how my political development, sort of shaped up. Maybe some background, I'm Indian, but I grew up in Hong Kong. My basically my whole childhood until I was about 18 years old, before I moved to Canada. Um, and growing up in Hong Kong, I feel like, uh, yeah, I could go into my whole story. I'll try to keep it brief, but I feel like, so Hong Kong. I'll always remind folks because not everyone knows about the history of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one of Britain's latest colonies to be
Hmm.
decolonized. So Hong Kong only decolonized, returned back to mainland China in 1997. So
Which is
really,
crazy.
it is crazy. It is crazy, and this is a long history. Hong Kong was a British colony for more than 150 years. Um, you know, on the left, we talk about stories of the Chinese Revolution and the triumph that the Chinese Revolution came to. The Chinese Revolution, you can see, was a response to the century of humiliation, and the century of humiliation in China really did start at about the time when Britain was waging the Opium Wars against China and took Hong Kong as a consequence. So, and of course, being Indian, I have very strong consciousness of British
Hmm.
colonial history, and so coming from these two places really shaped my consciousness growing up. I'm also, second generation, from Hong Kong. So my dad's side, him and his siblings, they all grew up in Hong Kong as well, in British Hong Kong, under colonialism. I grew up with quite a strong consciousness about racism. So even if, I grew up in let's say like a lower middle class kind of upbringing. And with that comes a certain level of apolitical, liberal, kind of orientation to the world. Um, I still had a very strong consciousness about racism, anti-racism, and colonialism. It's really only when, I started to learn more about politics, get into politics at university, that kind of thing, that I was able to convert that understanding of racism and colonialism to a broader understanding of the political economy of imperialism more broadly and what capitalism has to do with that. So in terms of my political development, then I started in university in Canada, getting involved with the Social Democratic Party here, the NDP, the New Democratic Party. They're sort of a center left, social democratic at best, political party. I was involved with them for quite a while. Always found myself sort of on, sort of left of center of wherever the center was in that party. I was coming from the global south. I didn't grow up in this country, and one of the pitfalls of electoral politics in Canada, as it is in the US, is that you are speaking to people who will vote for you. And that automatically excludes non-citizens. And,
Right.
most of the people that I knew, most of my consciousness about immigration, about where I came from, I didn't see that being represented within the party. So, at a certain point, to keep things brief, I got disillusioned with the party. And since I was always left of center of whatever the center was in the party, I sort of looked to my left. That's where folks were talking about Marxism and Leninism. Though I was one of these folks that always saw Marxism, or maybe not always, but that did see Marxism as a sort of a white thing, a European thing. The common critique of Marxism that it's Eurocentric. There's a lot to say about that. But it's really only when I looked at, not only is that wrong, and you sort of have to undo all the propaganda about, especially China and the Soviet Union, that kind of thing, to learn that Marxism was really a method of the oppressed and an anti-colonial tool through history. So it's only really when I started to learn more about how Marxism was applied in the global South, particularly in the case of Burkina Faso with Thomas Sankara, that I started to learn more about the Third World Marxist tradition, come to the sort of political orientation that I have, and yeah, I mean, maybe just the last thing I'll say about myself is that now I study this. I'm a PhD student in Toronto. A lot of my work focuses on China, sovereign development, and China, but a comparative perspective between China and South Asia, which as I mentioned, are the areas I know best because that's essentially where I'm from.
Well, that's really, really great. Thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear that journey that you've had, from growing up in Hong Kong. I didn't realize that your dad's side of the family was also grew up there as well. I know we talked about it before, but I didn't know that detail. And so this, yeah, I feel like that gives you a very interesting and unique perspective on, particularly on politics and sort of the political culture in Canada in particular. And I think that you and I also I think had similar trajectories. It sounds like in terms of how we started off. I mean, obviously, everyone growing up in capitalist imperialist society does not start off as a Marxist, or unless you're like a red diaper baby. But you start off pretty far removed from and even kind of hostile to or skeptical of Marxism. In my case, I was politicized by the Bernie Sanders campaign when I was in high school, and that gave me this. I mean, in some ways, it's really great because it gave me a vocabulary of socialism at the time, democratic socialism, to describe myself, and it opened this door that I eventually walked down. But also, the sort of contradiction inherent in that is that it really gave me this very constrained and limiting understanding of what socialism is. That we could just be more like Sweden and that's socialism. Or I was really into like worker cooperatives for a while. I was convinced that if we formed enough worker co-ops, that would eventually become socialism. And I had no analysis of imperialism. And then I got really into anarchism for a while as well. And it wasn't really until the last few years that I got sort of pulled into the world of Marxism. And it was really through, I think, kind of similarly to you, an understanding of how Marxism functioned in the third world that got me to sort of see the light on that point, which is where I think there's a really strong convergence between our two experiences. Because I was for a while I was still identifying as an anarchist, I like especially during my master's in London, I was learning all about third worldism and international solidarity through the classes I was taking, and I started this tension started to open up in my mind because on the one hand, I'm sort of saying, oh, Marxism, it's authoritarian, it leads to all these failures, whatever, but also every successful anti-colonial revolution pretty much in history that has ever liberated a colonized people from colonial oppression has adopted some form of Marxism. Maybe there's something I should look into there. It took me a while to finally actually do something about that, but it was really during, I think, the Gaza encampments of last spring in particular. I started to really see that. I read the PFLP General Strategy, which I really encourage folks to read if you haven't yet. It is just, I mean, it is apart from its importance to understanding the situation in Palestine, it is also just one of the most powerful summations I've ever read of synthesizing Marxism with the politics of national liberation. And I think reading that really helped open my eyes to this. So that's a bit of a tangent just to say that I think it's really interesting to hear about our your path in relation to my own because I think they've been very parallel. And you, at the end of your answer there, you mentioned that you are in the first year of a PhD program in political science, which, as listeners know, I am as well. I'm at the University of Minnesota here in the U.S. and you're in Canada, and we're both in political science programs. Although my understanding is that your program is more, or at least your focus in your program is more focused on political economy. Is that correct?
That is more or less correct, yeah.
Yeah, and I know you were talking before about when we were offline about how your department has a very strong sort of like Marxist political economy tradition within it, which is really, really cool. I'm more in the political theory and international relations field, but it's also interesting that we're both sort of starting an academic career at the same time, you know, and I'm very curious to see sort of how our intellectual lives develop in the years to come. And I had I had the privilege of reading your master's thesis that you sent me earlier this summer, which on China and the Global South, and which was just really, really brilliant piece of scholarship. I know I said this before to you, but I can't say enough how much I appreciated reading it. But I guess just on this sort of point about being in academia and entering a PhD at the same time, I would love to sort of hear your thoughts on that broadly, because obviously, you know, something that we often talk about in radical spaces and activist organizing spaces is the dangers that come from, you know, academia, similar to how the nonprofit industrial complex functions of pulling people into this kind of closed off ivory tower, insulating them from real world political issues, political struggles, people's struggles, and creating it can, if you're not careful, really create this turn you, even a very radical, well-intentioned person can turn you into a sort of like self-referential scholar who only speaks to other scholars, and it can just be really, I mean, we've seen time and time again how it promotes careerism and it defangs people who could be really revolutionary thinkers and revolutionary intellectuals. But of course there's also a really rich history of people from the explicitly Marxist folks like Walter Rodney to non-Marxists but still very radical thinkers like Edward Said, who managed to work within the academy and within the sort of the scholarly milieu in different ways to still advance a radical politics that challenge and critique empire. And so I'm just curious to sort of hear your reflections. Maybe we could talk a bit about this, like, you know, being about a month into a PhD program, like what are your sort of first impressions of academia so far, and how are you thinking about both the opportunities and contradictions, politically speaking, that come from doing this work of anti-imperialist organizing, radical political education, while also existing within the very, very flawed institution of the academy? And of course, you know, us both being at North American universities, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the critical role that universities both in the US and Canada have historically played in settler colonialism and the dispossession of indigenous peoples as well as, you know, being sites of research and development for the military industrial complex and all these other very concrete ways in which the academy is tied up with imperialism and capitalism. So it's a really big question, but feel free to, you know, pull on whatever threads resonate with you. Just very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, totally. And after I, give my stab at it, I'm gonna throw it back to you because I'm also very curious, to hear how things have been so far, how, you've oriented around some of these maybe contradictions, I guess, that come up. Yeah, so I mean, and it's, Yeah, I guess I can just get into it. But yeah, no, I mean you're right. Okay, like the first thing for me was, I've been working on my project, the, International Solidarity podcast, for a little over half a year now. I've been able to put a, decent amount of time into it. This is something that I've really trying to keep hold of as I've started my PhD, because I think it's important work. I mean, it's not, important in a self-aggrandizing kind of way, but in whatever little bit of a contribution it is, I need to remain steadfast in it and to keep it up, in spite of, the pressures of this essentially whole new system or institution in my life that I have to, commit myself to. So, time is a really is one of the first things that, I would think of to talk about, because as we get, lots of readings to do. We have to familiarize ourselves. We have to engage in classes, and this is obviously leading up to um, developing our research proposals for what we're going to do in terms of our own research, our own dissertation. So this is a long path ahead, and um, uh, you know, uh, time. Time is really like something that's bothering me. I'm a slow reader infamously. So it doesn't help that I have like what 400 500 pages a week to read. I guess I'm conscious of saying this, and to those who have already completed their PhDs or are ahead in the academic journey, I risk sounding I guess novice, but I guess these are the real struggles that I'm sort of faced with, and I have to reorient myself. The critique I have of that, though, is that I often wonder whether I need to be, or we need to be, spending this much time doing readings, and especially as it relates to learning the history of a field. Okay, like for example, I'm doing a core course on comparative politics, okay? Because I think that's tr in the traditionally defined political science discipline, that is one of the subfields, comparative politics. And so you'd have to familiarize yourself with, the history of the comparative politics field, which, also came out of area studies, which is, in North America and the West, area studies is very much linked to Cold War kind of ambitions of the United States and of the West. And so you can see a field like that has explicitly developed sort of more or less in service of imperialism, right? Knowledge production for that. And so, very much familiarizing myself with all of this, you know, at the risk of being further engaged and further involved in other organizing struggles, right? Is this really necessary? And that comes to, another point where, it's like, if, because, I'm sure you and I think about, what is, uh, the revolutionary potential, I guess, of being an intellectual, being an academic, both right now as institutions stand as the way that they are, but also in a liberated future. So this is what is the role of an academy or intellectuals in a liberated future as well. And it's clear to me that the way time is used and the way that we're expected to use time, we're no one I know, finishes the readings. Everyone's, behind on things, is constantly running and catching up to things, spending big chunks of their day on this kind of stuff. Uh, it really does mimic, the broader rhythms of the capitalist system, right? Capitalism, essentially, sure, extracts surplus value out of labor, this kind of thing, that the traditional definition. What that translates to in real life is the stealing of your time and the shortening of time. And that's why, there are phenomena like revenge, bedtime, procrastination, that kind of thing, where people stay up late and scroll on their phones, and they don't understand why they're doing this, but it's because they're trying to reclaim some of that time, trying to slow down from the time stolen from them during the day. And so this certainly, like, applies as well in academia, where even though folks like myself and yourself are within this field to yeah, as folks invested in liberation more broadly, even though we come from that positionality, we're still sort of constrained by the rhythms of the capitalist system as it presents itself in academia. That's the first thing. And then, so time, big thing. And I really also want to get your thoughts and reflections on that. Because I'm not sure if you'll be exactly on the same page as me for everything. Maybe you will be, but so that's why I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. But the second thing that I, mentioned, which you also touched on, is the role of academia in knowledge production for empire and for, you mentioned settler colonialism expanding across the continent, but also imperialism more broadly. And I mentioned the Cold War. And even, you mentioned that, I have, the department at my university is more critical, more radical with, even with several Marxists. But there is even this tension between a Western Marxism and an anti-imperialist Marxism. So
Right.
imperialism, in whatever spaces there have been in these traditionally elite dominated, bourgeois dominated centers of knowledge production, whatever space there is for critical studies, even that is still very blind to imperialism, which is many would argue is the principal contradiction, at this stage, as embodied in the Gaza genocide and the regional dimensions of that. Um, Maybe, quickly, one example of that is I'm doing a course, a very interesting course, on the role of the state in development. So the
Hmm.
developmental state, and this course more broadly reflects the literature that's written on this in the West in political science discipline. So, starting out, our focus was on Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, right? The East Asian, tigers, or the, whatever it's called, the 40 Asian tigers, I guess excluding Hong Kong for now. But the puzzle seems to be that, discounting communism and the communist states in the first place, and sort of discounting the capitalist states of the global north, because obviously, the communist states we can't really consider. These countries in the global south seem to have use the state to develop and to advance from, the stereotypical understanding of a third world country to something that resembles modernity. And how was this done? And what role did the state play? And all this kind of stuff. Of course, it's interesting to study, and it's worth studying the actual mechanisms of the state in those historical concrete examples. But I think it's worth um, remarking as well that the entire core syllabus of this course does not discuss China, does not discuss other global South states that have been under sanction by imperialism, what role the state plays in resisting imperialist onslaught
Right.
via sanctions, that kind of thing. That would make a more I guess interesting and thorough, full scope study of the state and its role in development. But of course, the assumptions of this are the imperialist assumptions, right? And focusing on discounting the communist states, of course, but also focusing on so-called successes, right? Because a state like Iran after the revolution cannot be viewed as a success, or it's not worth studying the role the state has played in Iran's development and Iran's sort of resilient, I guess, development to the extent that it has been able to, because it is not, a shining bright example of modernity, that kind of thing. I'll stop there, but I wanted to toss it back to you and to get some of your thoughts on, um, obviously feel free to touch on some of the things I've brought up, but also, how has it been? What are some of these themes that are popping up to you as you engage in this, our first year, first semester of our first year, and how are you contending with that?
Well, now that the question's being tossed back to me, I'm realizing what a difficult task I gave you by asking it of you. But I suppose that's only fair. I think actually that first point you brought up about time was like is really that really resonated with me because I have, going in, I was so like going into this PhD program, I was spending so much time this summer really mentally preparing myself for like, okay, I know what I'm getting into. I know I am about to enter this world where there's going to be all sorts of institutional pressures and even just unspoken sort of pressures of like the culture of the academy to de-radicalize myself, to soften my language, to not put myself out there so much. Especially, I mean, we cannot set aside the like very real political economy of academia right now. It is no longer, yes, if you can make it to a tenured professorship, then you'll be making six figures and you have much more security and you're in this very elite position. But it's so hard to get there these days, right? I mean, and PhDs are by no means a guarantee of any sort of like social mobility. It is oftentimes a downwardly mobile track that puts you in a very precarious position, which is why I also think the university is a really valuable source of struggle, particularly on the labor front. And we've seen so much labor militancy among graduate students, among adjuncts, other people who are precaritized and proletarianized within the historically elite institution of the university. And so all of that to say that, the very real political, economic constraints of academia also create their own set of pressures to conform to certain standards of acceptable and unacceptable behavior in the academy. And I was going into this program very sort of putting a lot of time into thinking, how am I going to work through that? How am I going to resist those pressures? How am I going to remain steadfast in my principles and allow those principles to come through in the intellectual work that I do and the intellectual labor that I do? What I didn't really spend that much time thinking about was what role time plays in all of this. I mean, like it's like I got here and I'm doing 800 pages of reading a week. That actually, again, the second week of classes I tallied it up, I was assigned 789 pages across the four classes that I'm taking, and that's been a consistent theme in subsequent weeks of the semester so far. Like that doesn't leave one with time to be doing organizing work, to be involved in community, to be involved in organizations, right? I've been getting plugged in a little bit, but I'm really constrained in my capacity to do quote unquote real world organizing. And that's been a hard pill to swallow because the reality is also that, unlike I've been in school my entire life, other than a couple years of working after my master's, I've pretty much been in school my entire life. What's different this time is this is the first time where being in school is my job, and it's not just an academic commitment, but it is a professional commitment. I'm being paid to do this, right? And I am the coursework that I'm in right now is professional training for a career. And so the sort of expectations, it's not just that you're expected to work hard and pay attention in class and do the readings because it's intellectually and academically important, but also because that is what is professionally expected of you. And so that just changes, in college, it was easier to, skip class to go to a protest or to maybe not do all the readings for class because you're in meetings for your student activist org all week or whatever. Can't really get away with that to quite the same extent in a PhD. I mean, you just will fall behind so quickly and it's not sustainable. And so how do you sort of recalibrate your expectations of yourself and what you're able to do without feeling like you're sort of betraying your values as a person with revolutionary politics? I mean, that's a very much an open question for me because it's not that I don't think there is political utility or value to the intellectual work that I'm doing here. And in fact, I mean, we're not reading Lenin and Mao in my classes, although I try to bring them up in discussion when I can. Actually, in our political theory colloquium the other week, I brought up Chavismo in Venezuela as an example of grassroots participatory democracy. And I don't think anyone had ever brought up Chavismo in that colloquium before. I could be wrong, but my guess is they hadn't. And so I try to use this as a space to inject some of these more radical perspectives. And there are a lot of people in my department doing really interesting, critical, and even radical work as well that sort of feed into that. But it is in a very different sort of it operates at a very different sort of level where it's critical work kind of oftentimes within the context of academia. And it's the sort of critical work. This is a critique often leveled against the Western Marxist tradition that you bring up, that is always critiquing and always asking questions and not as concerned with finding answers. I was saying to my friend the other day that I think one of the problems with academia is that if academics have such a strong incentive to just keep asking more and more questions, because if they ever found answers to these questions, they put themselves out of a job. So especially on, quite, if you're studying political theory, it's very useful to always be able to keep asking these kind of vague, open-ended questions of, and what would it mean if XYZ, and where might this lead us, but never actually get at the meat of the problem. And that's sort of been a disorienting thing for me as a materialist, as a Marxist-Leninist who wants to really be concerned with, okay, we are like politics is about contesting power. And for me, it's about contesting power for the international working class. How do we do that? And sometimes the discussions that we're having in classes aren't even operating at that level. And so, how do you sort of thread that needle? Again, that's very much an open question, while also reckoning with the realities of just the time constraints that exist upon you. I mean, one thing that I've been trying to do, and you said this too, with like, you've been really holding on to your project, the Journal of International Solidarity, as a sort of a North Star for yourself to keep yourself grounded. I feel very similarly about both this podcast, Return to Bandung, and also my writing more generally, which I really see, and we can talk about this maybe in the next part of this discussion. I see that as intertwined with the podcast as a larger political education project. And for me, it is really, really important. It's frankly, it's quite sacred for me that I be able to hold on to time for writing. You know, I'm an early riser. I wake up at 5:30 or 6 every morning, just like as a force of habit. And I started doing that when I was working a 9 to 5 job because that gave me an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, if I was quick enough getting ready every morning, where I could just write, and that was my time for writing. Um, and I've still tried my best. It's not perfect, but I do my best to hold on to that, to still wake up early and still hold on to that hour and a half, even if I have a lot of readings to do that day, even if I have other stuff for my classes or the various colloquia, that sort of thing. I really try to still hold on to that time. Because if nothing else, then I can like go to bed that night feeling like, well, at least I got to work on this project for an hour this morning, and that's better than nothing, right? And I think just at like a psychic level, that's been really valuable because it also helps keep me grounded. I mean, something set aside all the politics, something they tell every incoming grad student is it is so easy to get sucked into this world and let it completely consume you. And then that's how people burn out, right? I mean, this is a lot of work and it's how you burn out if you don't have something to ground you outside of your PhD program. And for me, this has been that. So in addition to being a political grounding, it's also been sort of a personal grounding as well. A bit of a rambling answer, but I think that, just it came up for me in response to what you were saying about time in particular. Um,
And
I
if,
guess,
you know,
yep.
sorry,
No, please go
I
ahead.
just wanted to, give, pick up some of the threads that you were talking about. I won't go on too long before we want to move on. But the one thing that I forgot to mention about, the whole time thing is that studying is just one. I believe this is not the case for you, Pranay, because I think we talked about this before. Studying is not, the entirety of this for me and for a lot of other people in Canada doing grad studies. I'm also a TA, a teaching assistant, and
Of
even
course,
that
yeah.
even that title is sort of misleading, right? Teaching assistant. Like I walk into a classroom of 25 students, actually teach, actually have to grade, grade like 40 students worth of thing. I have two classes of, 25 and 15, that kind of thing. And so that's additional work. And so when you're talking about, class struggle and the labor at the universities, this is very much, a pertinent question, an important one. And, for those looking to the academic path, this is very much one aspect to bear in mind, and also one aspect to actively be engaged in and contest. And, that's hoping to work on that as well. The other thing that you were talking about, which was, the emphasis on critique and, critiquing back and forth until the world ends. This is interesting because I also
Literally
wanted to
while the
mention
world's ending around us.
literally, uh, literally. No, but I did want to bring this up before because it related to my earlier point about why is this field, comparative politics, just as an example, why is this so big? And I'm reading all the debates, and again, that's not to say that the debates aren't pertinent. I've certainly found, interesting threads, and it is informing my work, especially as I think of, what kind of research I want to do. But I think, we also have to acknowledge that the system of knowledge production is still a capitalist system, right? Where folks like you and I are encouraged to get publications out like ASAP because it'll increase our chances at job opportunities and this kind of thing. So people are producing into the ether, right? In a sense, right? Like you're writing articles, you're writing book reviews, you're writing all this other stuff for the sake of producing. So you're producing for exchange value, as opposed to sort of use value, which I think in some kind of liberated present and future knowledge production would be planned in some way or coordinated or organized, toward a particular end. And that, that's certainly not the case, as it stands today. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, waking up at 5:30, I really commend your discipline there. And, like that is, a good practice. And I want to highlight that because I think, you tell me if this is the case for, in your experience as well, but I feel like with the dominance of sort of, postmodernist understanding of things and sort of the shitty state that the world is in, there's a tendency among folks in my generation, I've seen it to sort of not take life seriously and the whole nothing matters kind of attitude, which is understandable. Of course, it's understandable. I'm not again, I don't moralize against people's individual attitudes and whatnot, because as Marxists, we know that there's a material basis that is giving rise to these, kind of phenomena. But all of this to say that actually things do matter, and if we want a liberated future for those of us that are working toward, national liberation and the struggle for socialism and transcending capitalism and class struggle and these kinds of things. That needs, when we talk about organization comes with the need for discipline, and yeah, I commend you for that kind of thing. That's something I struggle with, like waking up early, that kind of thing. So I'm sort of self criticizing here as well. So but yeah, discipline is important. Sorry, I'll throw it back to you, Pranay.
No, no. I mean, I will say it. It comes at the expense of sleep deprivation. So it's not that I'm going to bed super early to compensate. So I don't know if it's that commendable. Just the last thing on this before we move on, not to belabor the point, but you did bring up being a TA, which of course I completely omitted from my answer. And you're right. I mean, I'm super fortunate that my department. This is not even true of every department at the University of Minnesota. It just so happens that the structure of funding in my department is such that first years are on fellowship, and so we don't have a TA appointment. Starting next year, I will be appointed as a teaching assistant, and then have this whole other set of responsibilities. It's not that my course load is going to necessarily, diminish to match that. I'm going to also be teaching on top of everything else, which I will require kind of going back to the drawing board to recalibrate. Okay, how do I balance everything now? I will say though that I think that that is where the role of the university as a site of labor struggle really comes in, because I think the University of Minnesota, we just got a graduate union contract this last year. I believe it was just ratified, and the grad union has been pretty active here, and I've been starting to get involved, just meeting with folks in the union there, and I really do think that um, trying to organize within my department and to really make sure that do what I can to help my fellow graduate students see ourselves as workers with a position in relationship to the bosses, in this case, the university administration, where that's not just a labor struggle, but also a political struggle at this time when the university is under attack by fascist forces here in the United States on so many fronts. I think that also does open up opportunities for organizing that I am like as daunting as the prospect of having that much on my plate seems. I also am really excited to explore those opportunities. How can the graduate labor movement and the union actually like serve struggle and serve organization and serve activism on campus is something that I'm really excited to sort of work through in these next few years. I want to shift gears a little bit, to talk about political education. I know it's come up obviously throughout our discussion of our academic work, because in our private conversations that we've had, including the Zoom call where we were sort of planning and brainstorming how we want to approach this interview, we've both talked about how we see our respective shows, our writing, our other sort of work that we do as political education projects first and foremost. I know for me, this really comes through with my writing, where it's like I started out writing, I think, as like more of like a purely artistic, creative, literary project, but I have really since then over the last few years come to see it as a political education project, and that's very much how I see this podcast as well. And I know you've talked about a sort of similar orientation that you take towards your work. So I was wondering if you could just sort of speak a bit about what political education means to you, how you go about the overall task of political education as a form of praxis, how you incorporate that into your work, into your organizing, and so on.
The importance of political education, yeah, that is big. I mean, as it relates to, maybe I'll touch on how it relates to uh my work. You know what? Maybe I'll talk about that a little later. But maybe the one thing I'll say for now is, you know, you and I are Marxists. Um, there's a whole debate on whether Marxism constitutes a science or not, but I think from my perspective, it's certainly a scientific method, right? It's a method that you apply to the social scientific world, and there's a whole history in the West of sort of delegitimizing the social sciences as science because it's not, falsifiable in experiments, that kind of thing. Whereas, at the time that Marx and all were writing, it was these traditions between the natural sciences and the social sciences were more unified than they are today. Um, so, you know, I see political education as relevant in as far as that, right? Uh, the natural sciences, the field of medicine, these kinds of things have been pivotal, vital in our advancement and our well-being as a human species, right? This is really what marks development over the centuries, right? And you look at revolutions in the global South, uh, their priorities are one of the first things they do is of course literacy. I can get to that, but health, right? And is to apply the natural sciences, the medical sciences, to their local context, to have greater access to healthcare, to be able to deal with basic issues, right? Um and what I'm coming to with that is that you know, if whether we want to call it Marxism or Marxism, Leninism, or explicitly or not, we need, a better understanding of how the world works, how history has been shaped, how history has moved, and how we have come to our present, position today. And that's where I think, anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist political education, particularly of a Marxist, coming from a Marxist perspective, that's where it's relevant because it demystifies the world, uh, within the logic, within a scientific logic, right? And so I think that is sort of at a base level why political education is relevant. I should also say, like I was talking about literacy in the global South, right? This is one of the again, alongside healthcare, education is, a priority that that is made by communist movements across the global South. I think of Kerala, where my family's from. You can think of China. You can think of, Vietnam. You can think of, all sorts of contexts where as soon as you have a revolution, one of the first goals is to bring literacy up to close to 100% or as close as possible as you can get, because having an educated population that is able to make sense of the reality around them, and to shape their destinies accordingly, that is important. And so when we talk about political education, of a scientific socialist or Marxist perspective, this is again, part of demystifying how we got here in history, how society, you know, people sometimes are averse to the labels Marxism or averse to the labels of politics, right? We hear this, I don't get involved with politics, I don't like politics, that kind of thing. Politics is the study of society. We have to understanding society is not out of the scope of anyone's concerns because everybody lives as part of a society. So naturally, social, scientific, and a scientific socialist kind of approach to understanding the world is necessary in understanding history. That said, you know, the other thing that I wanted to maybe say on this is that the spaces for discussion for social life where social bonds are relevant have been being reduced over the past years in the global north. I mean, you can think of differences between the global north and global south, where we're based in the global north, so we'll talk about that. Have been shrunk, and as a result directly of repression, right? My alma mater, where I did my undergrad, McGill University, is a super Zionist university. During the Palestine encampments and the Palestine protests, uh, at some point, and McGill University is smack in the middle of downtown Montreal, and is really a transit place, for non-students, former students, that kind of thing. they entirely closed that space to to foot traffic and to bicycles and that kind of thing. And this is an important part of downtown Montreal. And so I guess that was an aside, but the spaces for social life in which political education can find relevance and take root, those have been reducing, significantly over the past decades. And so part of this struggle that's related to political education is, I guess we can't necessarily just think of, okay, political education, we sort of have to force our will in educating, the masses or force our will in educating, those around us without thinking maybe conceptually, maybe strategically about what are those contexts in which that occurs, and integrating as part of our struggle the expansion of those spaces, right? Expanding the spaces in the university to have critical discussions, expanding the spaces online, right? And then that we'll probably come to that. That's where um, that's where our projects are sort of situated in the online sphere, and that is still very much a concern on how open will these spaces be to critical, even revolutionary, sort of approaches and critiques, So, um, yeah, maybe I'll stop there, on that. Yeah.
No, I definitely agree with everything that you said, and I think it really maps on very closely to how I see my approach to political education, why it's so important to me. I think your point about literacy in these third world anti-colonial socialist revolutions is especially important. Like there is a reason why one of the first priorities of all of these governments, whether in Cuba, Burkina Faso, Vietnam, you name it was, in addition to land redistribution, women's empowerment, all these other things, mass literacy programs. I mean, that might not immediately come to mind for someone here in the first world. In fact, I actually very distinctly remember a debate that I was having with a an old friend, a teacher from high school who I'm still very close with, who actually her class was very influential in sort of starting me on a path towards radical politics. Although she herself is a very dyed-in-the-wool center-left, like Democratic Party liberal, big Hillary Clinton supporter in 2016 and everything. And we were having this debate about Cuba, and she was just repeating the sort of anti-Cuba talking points you might hear about, if you turn on CNN or read the New York Times, oh, it's a dictatorship, it's whatever, it's this, it's that. And I was pushing back in all these ways, and I was trying to also talk not just about how Cuba is actually much more democratic than you think, but also the very substantive material achievements of the Cuban Revolution. And I brought up literacy. I was like, well, literacy went from like negligible, like a very small proportion of the population was literate prior to the revolution, to just 2 years after the revolution, nearly 100%. And she sort of shrugs her shoulders and she says, well, what good is mass literacy if all you can read is government propaganda? And I was just like floored by that, because I just remember sitting there in this coffee shop with her, and I was like, those are words that can only come out of the mouth of someone who has lived their entire life in the belly of the beast, in the imperial core. Someone who has like never known, not that I've ever known, but someone who has like never known what it actually is like to be illiterate, and to not who can't even begin to conceptualize the power, the humanization that literacy brings to people. Like there is a reason why slave masters did not allow their slaves in the American South to learn to read. There's a reason why feudal lords don't allow their serfs to learn to read. In all of these countries in Europe and across the third world, it is because of the power that comes with that. And that power is something that Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, Thomas Sankara, they all recognized. They all recognized that if you teach people, if you educate them, you empower them as subjects, you make them into full human beings when that humanity is denied to them before. I mean, we're seeing in the genocide in Gaza, there are no universities left in Gaza. I was just reading this morning that 92% of school buildings in Gaza have been destroyed, along with 92% of residential buildings and commercial buildings as well. But Israel has really gone after educational institutions, because if you want to dehumanize a group of people, if you want to strip them of their humanity and of their ability to resist, most importantly, you take away their education. And I think that that is really central to, I mean, I even like sometimes I struggle maybe with talking about political education, because that sort of sets it apart from other education. All education is political, and that is a bit of a truism, I think. But I think it's also true that, like, if we want to talk about what would an educational system look like, the day after the revolution, in this liberated future, it's we have to think about incorporating a revolutionary worldview, a Marxist worldview, into all aspects of education. It's not just that the kids go from math class to science class to Marxism class, right? Like that's not how that goes. You have to really integrate a revolutionary worldview into education, into pedagogy. This is so central to any sort of liberatory political project because the way you teach people is going to shape the way that they see what is possible for how the world can be structured, the world that they live in, society that they inhabit. And I think that, especially here in the United States for me, and I'm curious to hear if you find it to be different in Canada, but like on the left here in the US, very broadly defined the left, this such as it even exists. Um, I've found that there's this like hostility to political education, particularly to Marxist political education, both because of the sort of very strong anarchist influence on the left, which sort of like thinks that, oh, if you start reading too much Lenin, you'll become a Leninist. Well, that's like a cult of personality around this individual, like whatever. But also, there's this sort of hostility to doing political education, to doing political study, to reading theory. Like the theory bro is this archetype that gets sort of thrown around dismissively. And not to say that it doesn't exist. I've met some really obnoxious people in left circles who just treat like the works of Marx and Lenin and Mao and Stalin as if they're the gospel. That does exist, and it's really, I think, politically unhelpful. But people have this sort of reflexive hostility as a result of that, this backlash against it, which then leads people to say that, oh, reading theory is an inherently elitist. It's inaccessible to people. One, I think it's a really patronizing view of ordinary people that most people are too stupid to understand what Lenin is saying. No, some texts are challenging, but anyone is capable of understanding them if they're, especially if you are studying with other people, which I think is one of the best ways to engage in political education and study is to do it communally with other people. I mean, there's a reason why the Black Panther Party formed out of a study group at Oakland's Merritt College. That's where the founders of the party met, and they were reading together and helping each other to understand these concepts of, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and that is where the nucleus of the Black Panther Party, the most revolutionary organization probably in American history, came out of. And so I think that we really need to push back against this narrative. I know my statements here is a bit all over the place, but I think we really do need to push back against this narrative that political education, political study, political theory, even a radical theory that is inherently inaccessible, and that it's a waste of time to even try and engage in political education work, because what that leads to is, and I'll say this, and then I would love to hear any thoughts you have, but like the danger of allowing that anti-intellectualism, because that's what it is, anti-intellectualism, the danger of allowing that to take root on the left is that what you get out of reading theory and studying theory and politically educating yourself is an analysis. It's a lens through which to view the world in dialectical and historical materialist terms. And if you don't have that, then you have this very idealistic perception of politics. Even if you consider yourself on the left, where are your beliefs coming from? They're coming from this sort of vibes-based conception of like, oh, well, this seems good to me and that seems bad to me. And that leads you, and that can be good up to a certain point. I mean, I think that there is a morality is really central to left politics. We are fighting for a world that we're fighting for because we believe it is good. But also, there has to be the scientific element that you talked about. Otherwise, you end up in these idealistic rabbit holes, which lead to this sort of purity politics. That's where you get people who are saying, oh, well, I can't defend Venezuela or Cuba or any of these countries against sanctions and imperialist aggression because they're authoritarian. Authoritarianism is bad. Sure, in the most abstract vacuum sense, like in the most abstract sense in a vacuum, authoritarianism is bad, but that doesn't really mean anything as a statement if you abstract out all of the context of sanctions, of imperialist aggression, all of these other factors that lead states to take certain decisions. And if you don't educate people so that they have an analytical framework through which to understand politics, international relations, and so on, you lead them down these idealistic rabbit holes very quickly. I know that was a very rambling, expression of my thoughts, but I don't know if you have any responses to any of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about anti-intellectualism, right? We were talking about literacy campaigns in the global south, right? I mean, can we even imagine if in rural India, if a farmer or peasant wanted to, needed to, become literate, saying to them that, hey, it's only the Brahmins or it's only the elite that read. So, don't read. It's elitist. It's elitist to read. It's elitist to learn how to write and read. That's ridiculous. And like also, I should say, like, the comment that your teacher made about Cuba and literacy is just so that's ridiculous as well, and it's so insulting. And again, it's this, and to tie it back to this anti-intellectualism in the global north, it's this lack of understanding of the world, right? Like, and imperialism, meaning, i.e., the transfer of wealth from the rest of the world to support your lifestyles on the core, is really what's behind these tendencies, right? So if we shouldn't uh, you know, um, politically educate ourselves, if there shouldn't be some kind of systematic way of learning theory or reading X, Y, or Z text to then organize to then reach a kind of a political goal. If that is elitist or if that is authoritarian, then the suggestion there is just okay, then just do nothing because because it's bad, like because authoritarianism is bad, and to do nothing, and you can only do nothing when you're supported by the wealth of the rest of the world, right? Then you can only the assumption there, the underlying assumption is just go back to being an individual like the West wants you to, like the elites in the West want you to. Just retract, just pull back, just live your own consumerist, unsustainable, ecologically unsustainable, socially unsustainable, individualized life. There's no point getting organized. There's no point, striving for something beyond the individual self and vanity. That's really where, this anti-intellectualism tradition, that's the basis for it, right? It means be an individual. It means there's nothing worth fighting for beyond your own individual, the kind of desires, sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, forget it. But yeah, nothing beyond your individualism. That's maybe the only thing I wanted to say on that. Very frustrating if you can't tell already. But maybe, here I, want to ask you something, and I'll obviously also reflect back on it because this is something I think about when it comes to the scope of political education. What is it that we're actually talking about, right? So if you and I agree that political education has its role, it needs to, it needs to be a thing, and you and I both have our own projects, right? Who do we talk to? Because as I mentioned, or who do we address in our political education projects, as flawed as they might be, and especially in my case, right? I was really hesitant to even start a project or put out a podcast because I'm like, what good is it putting something out there in the world to just to work on in this kind of unsystematic kind of way, just putting stuff out. But anyway, so I mentioned that my I started my project trying to address people in my community about drawing the connections between India's and South Asia's, colonial history and what's happening in Palestine to foster that, to foster that understanding, to foster that international solidarity. There, implicit in that is that I'm trying to reach people who are otherwise maybe not politicized and who otherwise might feel some sort of way about injustice or about, the killing of children, of course, all these kinds of things. But with that first article and, subsequent articles, and you can still see this maybe in some of my work, I'm still trying to reach people who are otherwise maybe don't have a political orientation. Now, there are others who have political education projects that attempt to reach those of us, already on the left. Uh, there are podcasts, there are shows, there are obviously books, there are zines, all this kind of stuff, trying to reach and to advance the knowledge of those who might be Marxists or might be third worldists. And then more broadly, you can say on the left there's a big liberal or postmodernist, radical, rad lib kind of tendency as well. Are we addressing that broadly defined group of people alongside the Marxists? Like, are we trying to narrow in on? So, so I guess this is what I'm going to throw to you is who is political education for? And again, coming back to this question of literacy, because um, there, and maybe I'm prematurely answering the question, but there, it is certainly worth reaching sort of the masses, or those that don't have a political orientation, that is necessary because, um, so much Western propaganda, has taught us how to think and orient ourselves in an unscientific way that, that basically does not accord with the rest of history, right? Anyway, I was going to go on another tangent, but I'll leave it at that and throw it at you.
No, that's a really, really good question. And I think it is really important to talk about different audiences. Sometimes these discussions of political education on the left kind of treat our intended audience as a monolith and the masses as this sort of amorphous entity. But the reality is that like we need to disaggregate that a bit. I think that it's all of the above. We need to be having political education resources, output, work that is tailored towards a general layperson audience with no politicization. Also, some that is tailored to people who are already on the left or who are those sort of rad libs that you mentioned, right? Who are sort of have this left wing politics but aren't super sharp in their analysis. And then there also is a role, although I would say a little bit less of a role, for like the kind of political education that is just meant to sharpen the analysis of people who already have it down, who already are Marxists and have and just to sort of I think that's where you maybe run the risk of education just for the sake of making yourself smarter, which I mean, I'm a nerd. I love doing that. That's why I'm in graduate school. But also, I don't know if that's politically the most useful thing. But certainly, those first two categories I think are really important. And I've been doing a lot of thinking on this front because I think, like, especially the urgency of the political moment we're in right now really does require all of us who already are politicized, radicalized, who have an analysis, who see ourselves as revolutionaries. We have to be doing soul searching and asking ourselves, what do I contribute to the struggle? Where are my strengths and where are my weaknesses? We can't all be doing everything, right? Like we can't, like some people are better public speakers than others. Some people are better interpersonal communicators than others. Some people have better organizational skills and can do the like administrative work to keep an organization running. And we can't all do everything, and we have to like I think part of the sort of individualist narrative of the individual activist that we get sort of fed in North American, especially U.S. like left culture, treats us as if like like the revolution will be led by like a heroic individual who can kind of do everything. That's not how it works. So that's my very long way of saying that as I was asking myself that question, what do I bring to the table? Something I've realized is that I am like I think I am a very good communicator and I'm very good at communicating ideas to people, and which is why I do political education work. But I also know that because I'm a nerd, because I spend all of my free time reading and studying and educating myself, I oftentimes end up like speaking in jargon that isn't as accessible to people who have no level of political consciousness whatsoever. I mean, I really, in my writing especially, this comes through where I really try to avoid like super dense, inaccessible writing. And I think I'm doing a good job. And then I'll ask my dad, "Oh, hey, did you read my latest Substack piece?" And he'll be like, "Yeah, I did. It was really good, but I like had to look up every other word you were using." And I was like, "God damn it. That's what I'm trying to not do." And I think I'm getting better, but there's still a lot of work to do on that front. And also, to a certain point, I also think I should own it, right? Like this is the kind of communicating that I'm able to do and that I'm comfortable doing. So then the question becomes, who do I tailor that to? And we often talk about, at least, in the US, we often talk about like the left, and especially in organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a member, although not a super active member, like as being a big tent, and the left sort of being this big tent. I think in the context of the political culture that we're in right now, I think that does feel true. So then, with the way I think about that sort of big tent understanding of the left in relationship to political education is that there are some people whose job it is to reach out to ordinary people and bring them into the tent. Those are like just the organizers, the people who can go strike up a political conversation with your most normal average Joe on the street and get them at the most basic level without using jargon, without going too deep into things, to start thinking critically about, oh, capitalism isn't actually maybe as good as I was taught it was in school. This is someone like my best friend Archie, who's a union organizer. I mean, he is just like the most like personable, charismatic person I've met. I've been out with him on the street and he'll just strike up a conversation with somebody and within 5 minutes we'll be like best friends with them. We'll know their whole life story. That's what makes him such a good union organizer because he can go talk to people in a workplace who have no political consciousness whatsoever and to get them to think in terms of class and labor power. So I'm not that person. I just can't do that. I mean, I get too in the weeds, I get too in depth. So I'm not the person to bring people into the big tent. And that is one type of education work. But then the question becomes when someone enters under the big tent, what happens to them then? Do we allow them to continue to sort of hold on to these vibes-based politics, these idealist sort of perspectives that can lead to a very incoherent analysis that, especially on the question of imperialism, I think in the US is where it's a huge problem on the left where people, especially in the DSA, people, join the organization and then have these very skewed ideas about international politics that end up leading them to repeat CIA and State Department talking points. Well, I think that for people who are already have been politicized at a base level, that's where I can kind of come in. That's where someone with my skill set and my sort of orientation can come in and start talk to them in language that the shared language of the left, of socialists, of Marxists. I can use some of this terminology and these jargons, and obviously not go overboard, still explain things to people, define terms, and so on, but know that I'm not just going to be speaking blah, 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 and my words will fall on deaf ears because there's already some baseline level of politicization and interest. And for those people, I think that I have a really important role to play in helping to sharpen their analysis and then equip them maybe with the vocabulary, the tools, the frameworks to go and educate and radicalize other people in their community. Earlier this year, before I left Washington, D.C. and moved to Minneapolis, with the Metro DC DSA chapter, organized this 6-week teach-in series. It was an anti-imperialist summer school that was meant to be sort of a crash course in how imperialism functions beyond just military intervention, which is a way that often gets talked about in U.S. left circles. Imperialism is just when America does war abroad, and that's just a very small, piece of a much larger puzzle. And so, in that course, I remember in the last session, we were sort of wrapping up and sort of reflecting back on the last 6 weeks of how things had been going. And someone was talking about how they'd been at happy hour with their friend and they were explain their friend, not a political person at all, like just a liberal friend that they had. And they were able to start talking to their friend about US sanctions and how sort of imperialism functions as a political economic structure because of the lessons they had gotten out of this teach-in series that we've been organizing. And this is a DSA member, someone who's already is a socialist, already is politicized, but who, because of this political education opportunity they had within this existing left space, was then able to go talk to someone who's not already on the radical left and help to broaden their analysis of how imperialism works. It's a sort of snowball effect. That's sort of how I think about my approach to this and the audience that I'm addressing. Um, Obviously, I keep all of my writing and my podcast episodes open to everyone. I don't paywall things. I'm not intentionally trying to only limit to people on the left already, but I know that the average listener of Return to Bandung probably already does identify as a leftist, at least, if not as a socialist, a communist, a Marxist. And I'm okay with that. I think that can very quickly become preaching to the choir in an unproductive way. But sometimes the choir does need to be preached to because then they can go preach to other people. And so that's sort of how I think about. I would say that's sort of how I think about this.
That's great. I mean, that's very interesting. Um, I guess maybe the only other thing that I, really have to say about that is, or, I guess with me, I feel like, I I often sort of draw on my own experiences to, that then inform what I'm currently doing. And I feel like I've been quote unquote on the outside before, not as politically oriented before, even though, again, everybody has sort of scattered consciousness. So I had this consciousness about racism and anti-colonialism and this kind of stuff. And so I feel like this is a tension I continue to explore, and I don't have answers between, do you go for broad swath, broad base kind of political education, or do you do a targeted strategic kind of political education approach? And I feel like because I've been on sort of the outside before, and I've educated myself and oriented myself to quote unquote come inside, I guess, inside this, of the left, of the scientific socialist tradition, you know, I think my instinct is to then reach, broader groups of people, even if it's not to politically orient entirely everybody, right? Like in the most full sense, but to but rather to point out maybe flaws in their existing kind of political education or political orientation, to fill in some gaps here and there, that kind of thing. But there's a certain limit, I guess, you can reach with that. And then when it comes to, sort of the online platforms and, where my podcast goes up, right? I think, YouTube is very interesting because it has a very dynamic algorithm. And so even if I might think or might want to reach broader audiences, there are audiences that find themselves, toward my videos or my podcast episodes. And so then, am I in that case, do I then reorient to continue to speak to people who
Hmm.
are already on the left? These are like I said, these are the tensions, the contradictions, the different sides of things that continue to come up and that I don't have, the full answer for, as it stands. But I think one thing that I should say is that I think those of us on the left and that are serious, about organizing and serious about, you know, building capacity, building power. I think we do need to be better communicators at, for, regular folks, have less of, purity politics. And maybe the only thing I'll say on this is to come back to my other point about, as Marxists, we have to take seriously the conception of base and superstructure, right? And how we don't, if people have wrong, quote unquote, wrong politics, or are have mixed consciousness, that kind of thing, the Western impulse to that is very much informed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is to shun, to cancel, to reprimand, to overly moralize this or that person for their beliefs or their quote unquote wrong beliefs. But the approach is, society is how it is today, and the liberated future that we intend to build towards, it doesn't it doesn't happen, it doesn't take shape in our head. It happens with the starting point of our existing society, whether we like it or not. It's unfortunate for many to feel, to orient themselves in that sense, whatever. But whatever people's sort of scattered beliefs are, political orientations are, that is the starting point, and you sort of have to take it from that, rather than overly moralizing the issue, right? Um, I sort of lost my thread there, but I'll just leave it at that. I think I was anyway close to making my point about purity politics and that kind of thing. But yeah, ultimately we need to be better communicators for the layperson, and that might look different for different people, right? Like there are, rural white guys that can communicate in a particular way to other rural white people. You know what I mean? Like that
Yeah.
that might not be me, but yeah. So
No, I think you made your point really well, and I completely agree with it. And I think that that is, again, something else that you and I have talked about in our previous conversations. Just personally, has been the need for sort of an ecosystem of like left media, of including of podcasts, right? I mean, like someone, a hesitation that I had when I first launched Return to Bandung was like, does the left really need another podcast? Like, is that really what we need right now? And I. I mean, that's a valid question. But I also think that like there's certain to a certain extent, the more the merrier, right? Like the more the more nodes we can have in this network of media sources that people can turn to to educate themselves and hear perspectives that you are not going to hear if you turn on CNN or if you read the New York Times, the better. I think that that is really important, and that also then creates room for a multiplicity of approaches that people can take, where some podcasts are going to be much more academic or in their orientation, and much more sort of like geared towards an audience that already is familiar with all of the jargon and everything. And then some podcasts are going to, and also some podcasts will have very specific sort of like subject matter focuses in the kinds of guests they invite on and so on. And then others are going to be for a much more generalist audience, a much more layperson audience that is going to speak in more colloquial terms, maybe have more of a humorous approach. And so then, the same person, the same author who's just written a book, who then goes on True and On to get interviewed versus going on The Dig to get interviewed versus going on Upstream versus going on Journal of International Solidarity or Return to Bandung, even if it's the same author who's written the same book talking about the same things, it'll often end up being very different conversations spoken in different registers that will then appeal to different people. And the ideas that that author has put into that book will then get disseminated really widely. And that's a really, really powerful thing. I mean, especially in the age we live in now of such intense media concentration among these very, very powerful tech and media oligarchs and conglomerates who are really controlling the flow of information in our society and therefore controlling the limits of what we are allowed to think and allowed to say and allowed to do. I think that that sort of like diverse multiplicity is really, really valuable. And which is why I've said that, like, I like that we often overlap in our guests. And I know that you and I have actually referred guests to each other's shows before, and made that connection. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I hope that we can continue to do that going forward because I think that that sort of like networked media ecosystem is really important. I don't want to like overstate the, like reach that this show has. This is just one small like fish in a very large sea. But I know that it's something that I often do. I love listening to podcasts when I'm cooking, when I'm driving, going to the gym, whatever. Like that's a big part of how I educate myself. And oftentimes what I'll do is if I'm like there's a topic I want to learn more about or like a person whose work I've read and I want to hear more what they have to say, I'll just like search that into the Spotify search bar and then filter by podcast episode and see what comes up. And usually that person will have been interviewed on The Dig and Millennials Are Killing Capitalism and True and On and different all these different podcasts that I know about, right? And I will just like save those individual episodes to my Spotify library so that I have this library of things that like when I want to listen to something about that, I will go listen to that interview that I've saved. And that's how I go about finding podcast episodes. I'm sure other people do that as well. And so in that case, I've found podcasts that I never would have heard of otherwise that way and have found them therefore, like I once I listen to this interview, I go see, oh, what other interviews has this podcast done? And that's how I learn about other thinkers, other people doing really important work who are being interviewed. And I hope that that's how some people find Return to Bandung and also find Journal of International Solidarity, because it's not that like I've got a crazy social media reach or anything like that, but that sort of like networked approach to building an ecosystem, I think is really powerful. Again, at a moment of such intense media concentration.
Yeah, and uh, to add to that, I feel like I very much thought the same thing before starting my project of um I guess it is a little different because it started out as a writing project and then shifted over to the podcast format. And I was like, who needs another, male sounding voice with a podcast on the left? Like, no one really needs like, and is it fun to do this podcast? Is it great interviewing people? Of course, that I knew that would have always been the case. Is that enough of a reason to do this in a serious and disciplined kind of manner? No, but I think the reason I ultimately sort of went ahead and sort of you know went ahead with this was I don't know, like I mean the Gaza genocide is it really marks a new era in a lot of ways, and and I'm, sharing from my personal perspective. I'm like, what, sure, what are we doing more broadly to stop this or to contribute to infrastructure more broadly that can serve as an oppositional force to Western imperialism? Um, and then that comes down to me too, right? I'm like, what am I doing? And of course, um, everybody's in their own place in life, some people come to political consciousness or orientation later, some people have years of experience and all this kind of stuff. I figured that, this is the least I could do and and contributing in political education there. And once you put your foot in there, then you start to, like you're saying, make connections and networks with other people. It is important that because again, sorry, in my head, I'm like jumping between different things, but you were talking about how often the way that we're sold a theory of change in the West is the theory of the individual or the theory of the great man, right? We will change the system with a revolution led by a Lenin-like figure, and that's he's the hero and Superman and Batman and all this kind of stuff like that we're sold through Marvel and DC and all this kind of stuff. No, I mean, change happens at a collective level. People come together in an organized fashion to produce change. And
Hmm.
so the task then becomes, at least in my case, this is where I've come to, is how can I be the best cog in a broader machine of things that is building some kind of infrastructure that, whose momentum hopefully you can continue to raise and to grow, right? And so that is sort of where I see my role in my project. I do think, of course, there's a greater need for, sure, it's all fair and good that we've made networks and connections with several guests and other programs that are similar to ours. I think,
Hmm.
there is potentially space for greater cohesion, for greater organization, I guess, between
Definitely.
those on the media space. Um, and yeah, and again, just to echo what you're saying, um, you know, uh, at a certain point, perhaps quantity turns into quality, right? And that is to say, with a greater presence on YouTube, with a greater presence on the podcast apps, you cannot vacate or you cannot leave any given ground uncontested, and then sort of just allowing the far right to take that place because the way the system is set up. Uh, Liberalism and the liberal center is far less averse to the right and to the far right than it is to the far left, quote unquote, the far left. Um, so it is still important to contest those spaces, and would it be great if there was some kind of vanguard party or organization that is able to, that is reflective of, high levels of organization and political struggle and revolutionary fervor and all this? That would be great. We are obviously not at that stage. Like we are very far from that stage. And the reason for that is, these decades long since the neoliberal period of, um, uh, you know, authoritarianism, to put it simply, the clamping down on democratic spaces, particularly of the left, right? And so that's our starting point. We have to start from that, and we have to put one foot forward. Again, the Chinese saying of crossing the river by feeling the stones. You put one foot forward, and then once you're in that, uh, doing once you're doing a political role, then you figure out what your next role is, and it sort of serves as a guide. But the last thing to do here is to then, the last thing to do is to recede back into individualism and do nothing, right? Um, yeah, Vijay Prashad on my podcast, had this great line of, okay, if none of this stuff like sort of resonates with you, if you're not like, the alternative is to stay home and to be pure, like, and like that is not the point. That is not the point. That is not how change happens. That is not how we build power. Sorry, that was going on for a little too long.
Not at
Yeah,
all.
I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
No, not at all. I couldn't have said it better myself, and I'm glad you gave, Vijay Prashad, one of our many shared guests, a shout out where he said something very similar in my interview with him that I think about a lot, where he said that there is no politics of purity, there are only the contradictions. And I have quoted that line to people in many different conversations since then. But it also is conveniently a way to plug the podcast as well when I do that. Um, well, Ashwin, I know we've been talking for nearly an hour and a half now, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Obviously, we could go on for hours. Anti-imperialist political education is such a huge topic, and I know that I will definitely have you on the show again in the future, including in the not too distant future for all sorts of different conversations. So I'm really looking forward to what is the beginning of hopefully a very fruitful collaboration between our two efforts. But before I let you go, I want to ask you the same question that I ask every guest when I close these interviews. And I know that you give a really impassioned critique just now of sort of great man theory of history, and I share that critique. But nevertheless, I'm going to ask you, who is an anti-colonial thinker, leader, or revolutionary from any point throughout history who inspires you and why?
Yeah, tough question. And, there's, in, sort of your political work and orientation and all this kind of stuff, there's always more space to get to know a particular figure, a lot more and a lot deeper and all this. So I think of many names, but um, and I know I mentioned Thomas Sankara before, so that'll be sort of my unofficial second, but first and foremost, I have to say Mao Zedong. Mao, played a very important role in the history of the modern world, right? I mean, you know, the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution really, served as ruptures in history. If we enjoy, even in the West, certain standards of social democracy and rights and liberal freedoms and all this kind of stuff, this is because of the collective weight of the Red East, including China, Red China and the Soviet Union. The alternative that posed, in contestation to the West. Um, the Chinese Revolution, led by Mao Zedong, like also, served as, a great model for the global South, for liberation struggles in the global South. Mao, recentered an analysis of proletarian revolution around, the rural peasant and the peasantry as, sort of the rural proletariat as the revolutionary force in the Chinese Revolution. There's a lot to draw inspiration from there. I obviously, study China very closely. I grew up in Hong Kong in China. So, I could go on and on about Mao, and maybe I will just for a little longer, but I think being Indian for sure, like, plays a very important role in my interest in China, right? Because China and India and South Asia more broadly, I don't like to focus in on just the Republic of India, but there are a lot of commonalities between China and South Asia. There are a lot of differences as well, but we are really big populations, with the large agricultural sort of bases. There's a lot to learn in South Asia from the Chinese development trajectory. Not everything is going to be replicable, but there certainly is a lot to learn. And maybe last thing I should say, about Mao is that it's really quite incredible at his time that, when much of the Chinese population was illiterate, he, was able to rigorously apply the scientific method of revolution um, to transcend, mistakes being made. I mean, his theorizing of the peasantry as the central revolutionary force it's not just a given in history. We can look back at history and say, that made a difference, but it was, thoroughly rejected by, his other comrades until, if I'm not wrong, for like a decade before it was adopted as, the Communist Party of China's, official sort of orientation. Mao was also, a military theorist. He was a philosopher of dialectical materialism. There's so much there, and so Mao Zedong really stands out as, one of history's, someone that's contributed to recent history in a very significant way, more than most of us can really recognize, and that serves as a model for others looking to or seeking liberation, I should say.
That's a great answer. We love Chairman Mao on this podcast, and your point about sort of drawing a comparison between China and India is a really important one, and maybe it could be a whole other episode to discuss. I know you actually have a really great interview on your show. I encourage listeners to check out with Jyothishman from India and Global Left on comparing China and India's development paths, because despite the many similarities the countries share, they have taken very, very, very different developmental paths as a result of the different political situations that unfolded in those respective countries. And it's a really informative and thought-provoking episode. I encourage folks to check out. I will, of course, link it in the show notes. Well, Ashwin, again, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show and also just for all the work that you are doing with Journal of International Solidarity, and it's been really great to have you as sort of an intellectual partner to share ideas with and think through these very difficult moments that we find ourselves in now. For the listeners, again, I cannot encourage you enough to listen to Journal of International Solidarity, read Ashwin's work. I will link stuff in the show notes for you. And as always, before I let you go, I will leave you today with some revolutionary wisdom from Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, which is perhaps the most single personally influential book that I've ever read. I read it when I was in high school, and that was the first thing that ever really opened my eyes to a more radical conception of decolonization, even though it was a long way to go before I would adopt a truly radical politics. Nevertheless, in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon writes, quote, to educate the masses politically cannot mean making a political speech. What it means is to try relentlessly and passionately to teach the masses that everything depends on them, that if we stagnate, it is their responsibility, and that if we go forward, it is due to them too. That there is no such thing as a demiurge, that there is no famous man who will take the responsibility for everything, but that the demiurge is the people themselves, and the magic hands are finally only the hands of the people. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.